So, in case you haven't remembered, the economy is a social construction, and we're going to talk in this section about neoliberal capitalism. So, capitalism in general means that the means of production, like factories, farms, offices, etc., are owned by private individuals rather than the state. Capitalism is driven by profit. Adam Smith, if you remember from 1776, said that it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. What he means is that from them running their business, it makes money circulate in the economy and everybody gets a share. But depending on the type of capitalism that we use, the profits and who's in control of the means of production can change. And that's an article that goes through 3 different types of capitalism and is well worth reading. It's not a difficult, it's from the Conversation, so it's not a hard read. Okay, so the basis of neoliberal economic policy is 3 key principles. One is privatization. We take government assets and we privatize them and let them be run by private companies. And this might include ports or hospitals or schools or what else? Security sometimes. And it outsourcing also, that kind of thing. The second one is deregulation. So to attract foreign and corporate investment, we have to make the rules pretty lax. Companies would rather go somewhere where the environmental rules are less strict and it costs them less to process their waste, for example. Or when they have a contract that lasts for 50 years or 100 years. So we give, so that they feel that they have an advantageous situation to move into, either through security and stability or through conditions that suit them. And the third one is reducing government services and lowering taxes. So instead of providing a government-controlled health system, we pay less tax, but if we have to go to the doctor, we have to pay for the doctor. So it's that these all work together, privatization and deregulation particularly. Privatization and reduction in government services. What Milton Friedman's idea was that a perfect free market can work on its own to provide everything that we need. In week 6, what we're going to look at common pool resources and social goods, and we'll see that the market actually isn't very good at providing things that everybody needs, but not everybody can pay for. Okay, so this article by Quiggin, it's not an article, sorry, it's a chapter in a book. It's very good and I recommend reading it, but I've tried to pull out some of the key ideas. So neoliberalism started in around the mid-1970s, started in a couple of South American companies, Chile, for example, and then famously Thatcher in the UK and Reagan in the US in the 80s. But all countries ended up following neoliberal ideology, and it was entrenched through the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, etc. Anyway, neoliberalism is the ideological underpinning of the era of financialized capitalism, which emerged from the economic crisis in the early 70s, and it's remained dominant, it says, for the rest of the 20th century, but ever since then to now as well. And the central idea was that markets, particularly financial markets, generally outperform governments in the allocation of resources and investments. Now, this is a theory. It's not proven. It's not a fact of life. It's a theory. And it doesn't necessarily hold true. Nobody's really demonstrated it has worked. But in one form or another, neoliberalism became the unquestioned basis for thinking about economics for all government parties around the world. One of the strong things about neoliberalism is that the financial sector became almost all powerful. In fact, in 1987, financial firms were being described as the masters of the universe. So Bretton Woods was the thing that I was trying to think of before. The Bretton Woods system was the US dollar being pegged to the price of gold, and then everybody else being pegged to the US dollar rather than directly to the gold standard. Anyway, rapid financial flows, breakdown of domestic and international financial regulations, financial activity exploded and almost became decoupled from real economic activity. So when we talk about the economy and how the world works, we remember that the movement of capital dominates everything. It's like we talked about in the last section about it's not the price of moving the oil around, it's how much money you can make on the oil futures market. So by 1914, global market financial transactions totaled $4 trillion a day, which was 20 times more than real economic activity, so buying and selling of actual goods and services. This is the kind of environment that breeded companies like Enron. And if you haven't watched The Smartest Guys in the Room about Enron, you should definitely watch it. You'll find it on YouTube. And the trade in derivatives, and it was housing loan derivatives that caused the 2008 global financial crisis, was $500 trillion, so 100 times that. So hugely increased power and profitability. This works in a very real sense in terms of the power of buying futures in food goods drives up the price of food for people who actually need to eat the food. So it's about profitability over actual costs. So it talks more about, forget what I just said. Okay. So this rise in the financial sector, and at the same time, there was incredible amount of what they called union busting, or trade unions. Their power was hugely curtailed. Thatcher was very famous for breaking the coal miners union in the UK. And if you want to watch a fantastic movie about that, there's one called Pride. If you can find that, watch it. It's awesome. So the trade union movement decline, the rise of the financial sector, which works invisibly to most of us, but greatly increased the wealth of wealthy people. So Thatcher and Reagan came along. They wanted to abandon Keynesian stabilization. That was where the government created work for workers or created economic activity, and they removed the state altogether from non-core functions through privatization of government business. Water was one that went in the UK, and they're having quite a lot of issue now, the sale of public housing, and rejected the idea of income distribution, so lowering taxes for the rich, and minimize the role of state in functions like health, education, security, etc. So because Thatcher and Reagan's policies were so unpopular with people, the left-wing parties or centre-left parties came along and with this idea of the third way, a softer version, so but still the same economic ideas. Privatization, tax on trade unions, uncritical acceptance of the financial sector being basically in control of the economy, and attempts to halt or reverse the growth of the public sector. So it's all this reducing the public sector. On the other hand, the soft neoliberalism side also talked about the environment, and gender equality and whatnot. So on the social environmental side, at least paying lip service to those things, but on the economic side, still going with the whole neoliberal thing. Then we got to the 1990s, the end of history. I had a housing loan in the 1990s and the interest rate was 17%. It was pretty bad at that time. Inflation was also really high. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the alternative of communism. Francis Fukuyama famously claimed the end of history, that humanity had reached not just the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution, and the universalism of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. He was wrong, as we know now. But yeah, it was a big moment. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Union. It was kind of a turning point. But then we had all these crises in the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the dot-com bubble and bust around 2000, the global financial crisis, where the financial sector was shown up as not the masters of the universe, but basically corrupt and incompetent. The stock market collapsed, showing that this idea, which is the central idea of neoliberalism, which is that markets are the most efficient way to distribute money, just was shown as being wrong. And the costs of bailing out the financial sector, individuals' worth, was borne by the population as a whole. Reduced public services and wage stagnation in particular. So all the money went to bail out the banks, and then there was no money left for other things. So, yeah. And then in 2020, we had COVID, where the crisis was managed by governments, and governments provided the money that we needed to live on. And the financial sector didn't help at all. So there's Quiggin claims, despite its death as a credible theory of economics and politics, neoliberalism has stumbled on in zombie form, maintaining its hold over parties all over the political spectrum and over organizations including the International Monetary Fund and the OECD. So we haven't got an alternative as yet. Now, all of you in my classes will have lived in a neoliberal capitalist system your whole lives. You won't know any alternative. Whereas I kind of saw it happening in the 80s, you didn't see that. So when I say is it hegemonic, you don't know any other way, that because it just seems like natural. And in week 5, we're going to talk about power and this idea of what seemingly natural must be reality and truth. It's hard. Anyway, that's a really interesting article on Substack, and I think that Ryan Ward is a really good writer. Uh, this is a good essay by Dick Dowell. It talks about the reasons why neoliberalism doesn't work, or why this idea of a pure free market is a fairy tale, I guess, a myth. We talked about myths in week 2. It's a narrative that we live by, but underneath all the assumptions that go into the myth that we accept aren't actually true. And there's holes all over it, including the fact that power and money, wealth begets power, power protects wealth, monopolies, when capital completely dominates labor, when we've got no pushback, tax policies, etc. And the consequences of privatization is something that I would like to talk about. So with neoliberal capitalism, we talked about 3 things: privatization, reduction of government services, and deregulation. So when was it? Last year, there was a big drama in Australia about childcare, children being abused in childcare, and the childcare system was underpaying its workers, and that it wasn't regulated enough, it wasn't controlled enough. But the problem is, when you deregulate and you sell off to private interests whose primary motive is profit, you can't regulate ethics. This is the problem. And the consequences of privatization have turned out to be higher prices, not lower prices through competition or better allocation of resources. Higher prices, worse services, and the control of these things has gone over to companies whose primary motive is profit, not service itself. And this is a really good essay written by Roger Chow on whether the idea that you can't regulate your way out of poor behavior. So you can make as many regulations as you like, but if the underlying drive is profit making, you can't change that. And this came up last year with the Optus triple O outage where 3 people died. The triple O system is an essential service in Australia, but for Optus, which is a Singaporean company, all it is an added cost. And if the system doesn't work, well, sorry, 3 people died. And, they can pay a fine, but it's cost of doing business. So, who does neoliberal economics serve? It's not typically the people. Despite its dominance, neoliberalism hardly ever has achieved broad support, and it has required state violence, whether that's in the form of bullets against protesters, or whether that's in the form of harsh punishments for activism, or just coercion through withdrawal of funding. It hasn't worked for people typically. So this is a photograph. Chile was one of the first experiments in neoliberalism, and I've typed out some of the stuff here which I'll read out. So this is from an AP article, Associated Press article, which says that 50 years ago, Chile's army ousted a president, and everything changed. So 50 years ago, Chile began the darkest period in its modern history. 1973, General Augusto Pinochet led a military coup that included the bombing of La Moneda, the presidential palace in the capital of Santiago, where President Salvador Allende had taken refuge. Allende was a socialist who had won the presidency in 1970. He died by suicide during the assault that ended his 3 years administration, which was marked by economic turmoil and conflict with Washington over fears that he would install a communist government. So the US didn't want him as the president. So the US supported Pinochet. A junta led by Pinochet proceeded to pursue free market reforms that included privatization of state companies and severely limited political freedoms, repressed opposition to the military government. Street protests were brutally broken up. Opponents were sent to detention centers where they were tortured. Thousands were killed and disappeared. At least 200,000 Chileans went into exile. And this is a photograph of women, mothers, showing photographs of their disappeared children and husbands. If you want to read more about this, there's a part of a chapter in The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, which is a brilliant book on neoliberalism and disaster capitalism. It's in the library. And just a reminder, if I haven't said it enough, economic theory, economic ideology, economic practices, and our economic system are social constructions. And the outcomes of our economic system are a result of choices that we make and our governments make. This is a podcast about how neoliberalism, or is often called their austerity, has done, and it talks about from Thatcher to today and everything that we've just talked about. So if you're into podcasts, have a listen to that one. And that's it for me on neoliberalism. I wish we had another form of economics that I could show you in real life, but unfortunately I don't. But if you come up with one, you probably win the Nobel Prize.